Hi there and welcome to Watch It Played. My name is Rodney Smith, and in this video we're going to learn the 2 to 5 player game that comes in this giant box, Court of the Dead Mourners Call, designed by Pat Marino and published by Project Raygun and the Op, who helped sponsor this video. There once was a time when the forces of good fought evil for noble reasons, but now both sides have been corrupted by their endless battle over mortal souls, and it was finally Death himself who saw the plight of humanity and formed a secret court to free the living and the dead from that endless war machine. But Death and his allies also have to wrestle with their own destructive nature, so you will work to be the one who best brings about their ambitions and your own. So join me at the table and let's learn how to play. To set up, place the game board in the center of the play area and draw your attention to this top left area. Here, you'll place a certain number of these Unity tokens based on the number of players as shown on the table found in the rulebook, which you're seeing on screen. We'll be setting up a 3-player game in this video, so that means we add 30 tokens. And the rest you keep nearby in a separate pile. These are known as the Ethereal pieces, and you'll put all of them on their spot found in the bottom left-hand corner of the board. The cards with this back are known as the Wallows, which you'll shuffle and place on the space marked for them here. The court cards, which have this back, are then shuffled and placed face down in their marked area. Nearby, you'll find this Dreadsgrip track, and on its 0 space, you'll put one of the game's track tokens. You'll do the same thing over here on the Celestial Suspicion track, and then by the board, put the Malavestros and Raker figures, the dice, and this Dreadsbane Token. Next, organize the guild figures into their 3 factions. White is the Bone faction, red is Flesh, and green is Spirit. Also place, but keep separate, the one unique model from each faction's color. Every person now takes a player board and collects the 10 guild ring and guild track tokens matching their faction's color, which is shown here. You also put 3 track tokens on the starting influence spaces of this column, and collect 2 Ethereal, which you store in this area here. Everyone should also take one of the double-sided reference cards for use when playing, and then the oldest player collects the All-Taker figure, making them the first player. Or you can choose the first player randomly. The cards with these backs are the ulterior motives, which you'll sort by the faction symbols showing on their fronts, which again are Bone, Flesh, and Spirit. If you have less than 5 players, remove any showing this 5-player symbol here, and then shuffle the piles separately, dealing 1 from each to each player. Also give everyone one of each type of faction token. Again, Bone, Flesh, and Spirit. The players now secretly look over the cards they were dealt, and they pick one to keep, putting it face down in front of them, returning the other 2 unseen back to the box. You also go through the faction tokens and find the one that matches your chosen card and put it face down on top of it. Then, when everyone is ready, you'll reveal your token and place it onto the spot for it here on your player board. Your other 2 unchosen faction tokens you can now return to the box. And while you can always examine your own ulterior motive card, you must keep this a secret from the other players, as it will reveal additional ways that you can score points at the end of the game. Next, separate these Mourner cards by their backs, creating 3 piles, and then go through each one and find any marked with a banner icon like this in their top right-hand corner. These are the starting Mourners, and each player takes the ones matching the faction token they selected, picking any one of these to keep. If more than one person chose the same faction token, then those players take turns selecting a card in reverse turn order. And once everyone has taken their Mourner card, the remainders you will shuffle back into the piles that we originally created earlier, and then these piles you will place separately beside the board. With the Mourner card you chose face up in front of you, you now collect the matching guild figure that shows here in its bottom left-hand corner. Within each colored faction, there are actually 2 separate guilds, and you can distinguish them by the style of their model. For example, a player taking this Mourner card would collect this Bone figure faction, where if they had taken this one instead, they would collect this other Bone model. Again, both are part of the same faction, but they are 2 separate guilds. Anytime you gain a figure, you add one of your colored bases to it and then place it into the crypt area of your player board. When you first gain a figure from a particular guild, you also need to find that guild's track on the board that shows its figures printed above it, and then you add one of your guild tokens to its leftmost space. And that's the setup. Now I should point out that I have the Kickstarter edition of the game here, but the only difference between this and the retail version is that the metal pieces will be thick cardboard, the player boards will be a single layer, and components for a fifth player are not included. But the rules between both editions are exactly the same. In Court of the Dead, Mourners Call, players take on the role of mourners, known as Death's agents, who work towards a common goal of uniting the three Death factions to end the celestial battle between good and evil. But only one mourner will gain the most points and be recognized in the end as Death's champion. The game is played over a series of rounds, and each round is broken into 8 phases, starting with Ethereal Distribution. Here, the first player rolls a number of dice equal to the number of players and then takes the total result in Etheria from the supply. These are divided into a number of piles equal to the number of players plus 1. So with 3 players, I make 4 piles, and I can divide them any way I like. I can even make piles of 0. So I could have 1 pile of 10 and 3 piles of nothing. But I would probably do something more like this. Now, beginning with the person to the left of the first player, and then going clockwise around the table, each person picks a pile and takes the Etheria in it, adding it to their personal supply. However, instead of taking a pile, you can choose to pass and take 2 faction influence instead. This area of the board tracks your influence in each of the Death factions, and the 2 that you gain by passing on Etheria can be divided as you like, taking 2 in just one faction or 1 in 2 different factions. To show an increase, you move the related tracker to the right. But over the course of the game, you can never have more than 15 influence in each of the factions. This is the rightmost space of each track, and any influence gained past this would be ignored. Once all of the players have picked their Etheria pile, or passed, any remaining piles are grouped together and then put onto the Dearth Forge of the board, which is located here. Now it's time to move to the Wallows and Rakers phase, where each player is dealt 1 Wallow card taken from the deck found on the board here. This is a quest that you've been given by the Court of the Dead, and you'll keep this face up in front of you. You'll have until the end of the round to complete it, and once you have, the game pauses and you immediately resolve its effect and then discard it. In other words, each Wallows card can only be resolved once per round. There are several different types of Wallow quests. Locations, celestial scouts, events, and followers will have a variety of different effects, and we won't go through each of them here. Instead, just read and follow their instructions as you play. Now these will often have various symbols, and they relate to different components, and you can refer to your reference for a breakdown of what each of them means. But we'll also cover many of the symbols in this video. Rakers are a special type of Wallow that refers to these figures, and it will indicate a location on the board where one of them appears. Speaking of which, let's take a quick look at the board. This is the Underworld's capital city, which is divided into 12 different locations, and each is governed by one of the factions as shown by the symbol beside it. This Raker refers to Mortis Veth, so we place one of those figures here, and we'll see in a later phase how a player can fight a Raker to try to complete their Wallow card. Artifact Wallows represent powerful objects, and once completed, instead of discarding them, you keep it in front of you, and then you'll be able to use its ability here printed in bold for the rest of the game. Now we move to the court drafting phase, where all 17 of the court cards, which are found in a deck on the board, are shuffled and dealt based on the number of players as shown on the chart in the rulebook. And you'll also find this chart on screen as well. In this game with 3 players, we deal out 4 to each player, as I've already done, and then you return the rest face down to the board. Now you follow the steps on the chart in order, labeled as Draft 1, Draft 2, and so on. For example, in Draft 1, you look at all of the cards in your hand, and you pick one of them to keep. The rest, you pass to your left. This means the player on your right will have just passed you 3 new cards, and the player to your left will have passed 3 of their cards over to the player on your right. You see, it just goes around and around in clockwise order. The ones that you receive, you then look at, and in draft 2, you'll pick one of these and pass the other 2 on. And you'll keep doing this until eventually you're past just one card, which you'll also keep. Each new round, when you get to this phase, you'll alternate the direction that you pass the cards. So in round 2, I would pass my cards to the right. And this just ensures that you aren't always passing and receiving from the same neighbor every time. Now, we'll see how to use the court cards a little later. But now we move on to the action phase. Here, starting with the first player and going in clockwise order around and around the table, players will take turns completing one of the 4 possible actions, or they can pass. And this will continue until everyone passes in a row. In other words, if you pass, but someone after you takes an action, then when it comes back around to your turn, you can choose to take an action or pass again. It's only once everyone has passed in a row that the phase ends. So let's go back to the table, and I'll show you how each action works, starting with recruiting a guild figure or a Mourner card. All of the actions are listed on your reference, and you can take this one in one of 2 possible ways. The first option is just to buy a figure directly, and this requires spending 3 Ethereal, which you take from your personal board and then return to the supply. The symbol here refers to any guild figure, and that means you can take any one of these figures, but that does not include these 3 unique ones that we set aside during the setup. Later in the video, we'll see how these are brought into play. Sometimes you'll see symbols like this when you're playing, and they refer to figures from those specific colored factions. Going back to this action though, after you gain a guild figure, you then add one of your colored bases to the bottom of the figure you collected, and then place it into your crypt. You then either add a token to the related guild track if you don't already have one there, or if you do, you instead advance it 1 space. These tokens remind you and everyone else of how many figures from that guild are under your control. If you ever gain more than 5 of a figure, you don't advance your marker any further. After recruiting a figure in this way, it shows the Dreadsgrip track symbol with a +1. So that means you move its marker up by 1. And we'll see how this can affect the game a little bit later. Now with this action, you can instead spend 5 of your Ethereal to recruit a Mourner card. You just pick one of the factions and draw 2 Mourner cards off the top of its deck. You'll then pick one of them to keep, placing it face up in front of you, and the other you'll discard face down on the bottom of its deck. You then find the specific guild figure pictured in the bottom corner of the Mourner card that you recruited. You collect it from the supply and add your base to the bottom, putting it into your crypt and increasing your marker on the related track, or adding one if you don't already have one there. Then finally, as you're reminded here, you increase the Dreadsgrip track by 1. So both recruiting a guild figure and recruiting a Mourner card will give you a new figure. It's just that in one case, you also get a Mourner card as well. But I should point out, your bases are limited. If you no longer have one of these, then you cannot take any new figures. You can still gain new Mourner cards, but if you do, you don't take the figure that goes with it. And if Mourner cards would ever run out, and you're owed one of these, then you don't get either the card or the figure. And in the same way, if the supply of a particular type of figure runs out, then you ignore any effect that would try to give you one. Otherwise, the card that you gain and the figures that you collect, they act independent of each other. If you lose the card later, you don't also lose the figure, and vice versa. Now, with that understood, let's look at another type of action you can take, playing a court card. To do this, play one from your hand face up to the table. These always have 2 possible actions, and you pick just one of them to resolve. Then when you're done, you discard it face up to the top of the deck. Now we won't go through all of these, but let's take a look at a couple just to give you some familiarity with how they work. If an action shows a colon, then you must pay what is on its left, and then you gain the item showing on its right. Now if you see a symbol that represents a faction, you adjust your influence over that faction by this amount. So here we reduce our bone faction influence by 1, and this moves its marker to the left. If the marker ever gets here, you have 0 influence over that faction and cannot pay that cost until you have more. And if you cannot pay the cost for an action, then you can't take it. If you see the symbol of a card that shows a specific faction inside of it, then it represents recruiting a Mourner card, just like we saw earlier. You would draw 2 from the related deck, pick 1 to keep, take the figure shown on it, add it to your crypt with your base attached, and go up on the related guild track. Now earlier when we showed this, you also increased the Dreadsgrip track by 1. You only do that in these situations if the card instructs you to, which in this case it does. This here is the symbol for Ethereal, so it means you would collect 2 from the supply. If you see this symbol, it represents the Celestial track, and you adjust its marker accordingly. And we'll see the effects of this a little bit later. Now I should point out that if either the Celestial track or the Dreadsgrip track is at 0, and an effect requires you to reduce them further, then the marker just stays put, but you still gain the other benefits of that action. If an action would cause you to move Malavestros, it's referring to this figure, which you then place on that location. And anytime you see this symbol, it's referring to Unity tokens. These are taken from the supply on the board, and when you collect them, you put them into your area for them here. Each of these are worth 1 point, and when all of them are gone from the supply, it will trigger the end of the game. Now, if an effect would ever cause you to lose Unity tokens, they're removed from your board and put back in the box. They will never go back into the supply. Both of the actions on the Death, the All-Taker card, will allow you to take the All-Taker figure. This is the only way that it will change places. So that means it's the only way for the first player to change from round to round. 3 of the cards refer to these 3 special figures of the factions. If you take an action on a court card that puts one into play, you first add your figure to its base. However, unlike gaining a regular guild figure, you do not move your marker on the related guild tracks. At the end of the round, these will be removed from play and you'll take your base back. They do, however, count as members of their related faction, and you'll be able to place them on the board to help you control those locations, as we'll see later. Another action you can perform is moving your guild figures by selecting any number of them from one location and moving them together to a new single destination. For each figure you move, you then pay 1 influence matching the faction symbol of the location that you moved to. So bringing these figures here would cost me 2 bone influence. This is also how you move figures from your crypt. Just think of this as a type of location. However, you cannot choose to move figures from the board back to the crypt using this action. Some Mourner cards have ability that trigger every time certain things happen during gameplay, while others, like this one, will only resolve once per action phase. So after resolving the effect at the appropriate time, which will cost you an action, you then flip it over as a reminder that it cannot be used again that round. Earlier I mentioned that a player might have to add a Raker to the board when taking a Wallows card. And this will say that as an action, you can fight it with a guild figure that you have at its location. But just to be clear, only the person who has the Wallows card for that Raker can attempt to attack it. And it will describe on the card how you do this, and then whether you succeed or fail, the Wallows card and the Raker are discarded. Once all of the players have passed in a row, the action phase ends, and any unused court cards that players are still holding are discarded. Now you resolve the Dreadsgrip track, which represents the growing greed and power of the various factions. As it increases, they can be overwhelmed by their own selfish desires rather than working in harmony. Check to see where the marker is on the track. The value to its right is the maximum number of guild figures allowed at each location on the board. But do not count Malavestros in these situations. For any location that does have more than the allowed amount, like the one we see here, you'll need to roll some dice. One at a time, each player points to a figure they have there and rolls a die. For every result of 3 or higher, nothing happens to the related figure. But if you roll a 1 or 2, the figure is returned to its owner's crypt. You're reminded of how this works right here on the board. And even if some figures are removed this way, you must still continue rolling dice for each other figure that remains there. Now, if the marker on the track is at 8 or higher, then as it shows here, if instead a 1 is rolled, the related guild figure is destroyed. You take your base back from it and return the figure to the supply. We'll see later how this Dreadsbane token is collected, but if a player has it, then they do not roll dice for their figures during this phase. During gameplay, if the Dreadsgrip meter ever reaches 10, The player who made that happen suffers a penalty. The person to their left picks any one of the penalized player's Mourners cards, and then they lose it, along with a matching guild figure if possible. And remember, that figure will be pictured here in the bottom corner. When you lose a guild figure, you keep the base from it, but you put the figure back into the supply. Then, all other players lose a guild figure of the same type, if possible. The meter is then reset to 9, and play continues. Anytime you lose a guild figure during the game, you move your related token backward, or you take it off of the track if that was your last figure from that specific guild. Though I should mention, if an effect simply returns a guild figure back to your crypt, you have not lost control of it, so you do not move your related marker. Similarly, if you lose one of these special guild figures, you also do not move your marker on the guild tracks. You'll remember, when these are gained, you don't go up on the tracks either. Now we come to the next phase, paying the celestial tithe to heaven and hell. Many of the activities you'll take during the game can catch the attention of these celestial bodies, and we need to pay them off so they continue to ignore us. For this, you'll now check the celestial track. The value to the right of your marker is how much Ethereal we'll need to pay, and it's equal to the number of players, which is represented by this symbol, plus the amount here. So in this case, we need to pay 3 plus 4, or 7 Etheria. Any Etheria in the Dearth Forge is now returned to the supply and subtracted from the amount we owe. So now we only have to pay 5 Etheria. Every player now takes all the Etheria from their boards and hides it, putting the amount they're going to contribute during this phase into a closed fist. Players can discuss what they'll do, but they cannot show what they are actually doing, and they don't have to honor any commitments that they make. Once everyone is ready, they all simultaneously open their hands, and the contributed Etheria is totaled and returned to the general supply. Any amount you didn't contribute, you just put back onto your board. Now, if the required quota is met, then the player who contributed the most gains 3 Unity tokens, and all other players who contributed at least 1 Etheria take 1 Unity token. If there's a tie for the highest contribution, then the tied players instead each just gain 1 Unity. Players who did not contribute Etheria at all do not collect any Unity and instead lose 1 influence of any type. Now, if the celestial quota had not been met, the player or players, if tied, who gave the least lose 2 Unity each, which is just removed from the game. You do not put it back into the supply. If a player didn't have Unity to lose, then they would spend faction influence to make up the difference. Then both the Celestial and Dreadsgrip track increase by 2. Now if this causes the Dreadsgrip to hit 10, each player who contributed the least Etheria loses 1 Mourner card and figure as described earlier. You then move the Dreadsgrip back down to 9. If the Celestial track hits 10, either now or at any point during the game, the player or players who caused this to happen lose 3 Unity each, spending faction influence to make up the difference if they don't have enough. And don't forget, when you lose Unity tokens, it does not go back to the supply, instead it's removed from the game. With all the tithes paid, it's time for the Resolving Locations and Guilds phase, where we start by checking all the locations on the board. You'll go through these one by one in order based on the numbers printed at each location, skipping any that are empty. The player with the most figures at a location then gains the benefit shown here, and if there's a tie, no one gets the bonus. Now we won't go through each of these various benefits as they're explained on the board itself. But if you do have any questions, you can check the back of the rulebook here where they're explained in further detail. You'll also find the guild majority benefits as well, and we're going to talk about how you gain those right now. Once all of the locations have been checked, you'll resolve the guild tracks from left to right, and during this phase, the player furthest on the track gains the bonus printed there. In the case of a tie, no one gets the benefit. This track here awards the Dreadsbane Token, which that player would then take. However, if there's a tie here, then the player who currently has it must return it to the supply. There is one way to break a tie during the game, and that is by the player who is holding the all-taker figure. They may, once per round, win a tie at any one location or guild track. Either way, once this phase is complete, we move to the cleanup phase. Here, players resolve any cleanup phase abilities they may have on their Mourner cards. Then, if any of the 3 special faction figures are on the board, they are returned to the supply, and the bases are returned to the related players. Any Wallows still in play are now discarded as well, and some of these will have effects that resolve if they are not completed by the end of the round, and those would happen now. Also, any Mourners cards that were activated are reset for the next round. Speaking of which, if there are still Unity tokens in the supply, then that means another round begins. But if the supply is empty, you now proceed to final scoring. If this supply ever empties during the action phase, then every player, including the current one, takes just one more action, and then you end the action phase, though you'll still resolve all the other phases of the round. Now, if the last Unity token is collected during any phase after the action phase, you as well finish out the rest of the round. The important thing to understand is that when the Unity supply runs out, players can still continue to collect any Unity they are owed. They just take it from the supply that was created beside the board during the setup. And if that supply runs out as well, then just use any suitable replacement. With the game over, players total the Unity tokens they collected and add to this the influence points showing above their influence markers. For example, I would get 6 points for the Bone faction, 0 points for the Flesh faction, and I would get 10 points for Spirit. Next, you reveal your ulterior motive and claim any points from it that you've earned. Now, the player with the most points wins. And if there's a tie, the tied player with the most Ethereal wins. And if there's still a tie, the tied player with the most Mourner cards in play is the winner. And if there's still a tie, the tied players share the victory. And that's how you play Court of the Dead, Mourners Call. If you have any questions about anything you saw here, feel free to put them in the comments below, and I'll gladly answer them as soon as I get a chance. You'll also find forums for discussion, pictures, other videos, and lots more over at the games page on Board Game Geek, and I'll put a link to that in the description below. And if you found this video helpful, please consider giving it a like, subscribing, and clicking that little bell icon so you get a notification anytime we post a new video. But until next time, thanks for watching.